Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a subject that's especially crucial for you UPSC aspirants out there, particularly those of you grappling with the intricacies of international relations. We're going beyond the usual theories and diving headfirst into the fascinating world of post-positivism. Now, don't worry, this isn't about memorizing obscure terms.
Right.
It's about understanding how we make sense of global politics in a whole new light, which, let's be honest, is pretty useful for anyone, whether you're prepping for the UPSC or just curious about the world.
What makes post-positivism so interesting is that it challenges the idea of a single objective truth in international relations. It encourages us to look beyond the surface of events and consider the beliefs, perceptions, and social forces that shape how states act and interact.
It's not just about observing what countries do on the world stage,
Yeah.
but understanding the why behind those actions.
Precisely. Post-positivism pushes us to ask questions like, do countries act solely based on facts? Or do their perceptions and interpretations of the world, even if those perceptions are subjective, also play a significant role?
That's a big shift from those traditional realist theories that often dominate international relations, right? It makes you wonder if power dynamics are always about conflict, or if there's room for alternative models based on cooperation and understanding.
Exactly. And post-positivism also prompts us to consider how factors like gender dynamics and cultural biases influence our entire understanding of global politics. These are questions that traditional approaches often overlook.
This is starting to sound pretty relevant for those UPSC essay questions, getting us to think critically and go beyond those textbook explanations. So to unpack these ideas further, we were looking at three key approaches within post-positivism: social constructivism, poststructuralism, and feminism.
Each of these offers a unique lens for analyzing those complex global interactions, which, as you know, is a key skill for anyone tackling the UPSC exams. But even beyond the exams, these approaches can help us make sense of the world around us in a much deeper way.
All right, let's dive into the first approach, social constructivism. So what's the core idea here? Help us wrap our heads around this.
At its heart, social constructivism argues that the reality we experience, especially when it comes to social and political issues, isn't simply out there waiting to be discovered. Instead, it's something we actively construct through our interactions, our shared beliefs, and our ideas.
Instead of the world coming a set of predefined rules and labels, we as individuals and societies actually give meaning to events, concepts, and even to things like anarchy in the international system.
That's a great way to put it. The world doesn't come with an instruction manual. We create the meaning.
This reminds me of Alexander Wendt, a major figure in constructivism. He famously said, anarchy is what states make of it. That seems to be a pretty central idea in constructivism. Right?
Yes, absolutely. That quote perfectly encapsulates the constructivist view. It means that the fact that
there's no world government,
that
the international system is essentially anarchic, doesn't automatically determine how states will behave. So just because there's no global police force doesn't mean countries are destined to constantly fight each other.
Exactly. It all depends on how states interpret that anarchy. One state might view it as a dangerous free-for-all where they need to constantly compete for power and security. But another state, perhaps one with a history of cooperation or shared norms with its neighbors, might see that same anarchic system as an opportunity to build alliances and collaborate.
So two states in the same objective situation can react in completely different ways based on their perceptions and past experiences.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
It is. And it highlights why constructivists place so much importance on shared norms, identities, and ideas. They argue that these factors are just as important, if not more so, than material factors like military strength when it comes to understanding how states interact.
Okay, so to bring this down to earth a bit, could you give us a real-world example of how this social construction idea plays out in international relations?
Certainly. Think about how our understanding of nationhood and nationalism has evolved over time. The very idea of a nation is not some fixed objective reality. It's a concept that's been shaped and redefined over centuries by historical events, cultural shifts, and the way we talk about these things.
The way we define a nation today is different from how it was perceived a century ago, and those changing perceptions influence how states behave on the world stage.
Precisely. And this has huge implications for understanding a whole host of contemporary issues. Think about the rise of new nationalisms, the challenges to existing state structures, or even the debates around immigration and identity. All of these are influenced by how we construct and interpret the idea of a nation.
This is starting to feel very relevant to those UPSC case studies. We often have to analyze seeing those historical shifts and how they shape current events.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's important to remember that, like any theory, social constructivism has its critics. Some argue that while ideas and perceptions matter, constructivists sometimes underestimate the influence of pharmas of material realities.
Things like economic power and military capabilities also play a role in shaping beliefs and actions, right?
Right.
It's not just about ideas floating around in a vacuum.
That's a valid critique. It raises the question, do beliefs shape material realities? Or do material realities shape beliefs? It's a complex interplay, and that's why it's crucial to consider different perspectives and weigh the various factors involved.
It's definitely giving us a lot to think about. Okay, ready to move on to our next post-positivist approach? Let's unpack post-structuralism.
Let's do it. Post-structuralism takes a deep dive into the relationship between power and language, something that's often overlooked in more traditional approaches.
Now, this is where things start to get really interesting for me. I've always been fascinated by how language can be used to shape perceptions and even control narratives.
That's precisely what post-structuralists focus on. They argue that language isn't just a neutral tool for describing the world. It actually shapes our understanding of reality and has a profound impact on power dynamics.
So the words we use, the stories we tell, the way we frame events, all of that can actually reinforce existing power structures or even create new ones.
Exactly. Post-structuralists use the term discourse to talk about these systems of language and how they're embedded with power relations.
Could you break down this idea of discourse a little further? I think a concrete example might help us grasp it better.
Of course. Think about the discourse surrounding terrorism. Often specific groups are labeled as inherently dangerous or threatening within this discourse, which then influences public perception and policy decisions. This labeling, while presented as objective truth, is often rooted in existing power structures and biases.
So it's not just about what happened, but how we talk about what happened, right? The language we use shapes our understanding of events and influences how we react to them.
Precisely. A great example of this is how different actors framed and interpreted the events of 9/11.
Right. Some called it an act of terrorism, others a criminal act. Still others saw it as an act of war. Each interpretation, embedded within a particular discourse, had significant consequences for how governments responded, from domestic security policies to foreign interventions.
And that's a crucial point for anyone studying international relations, especially for the UPSC. Being able to analyze competing narratives and understand how language shapes perception is essential for deciphering those complex global events you'll be studying.
Like having to decode a message. But instead of cracking a secret code, we're trying to understand the hidden meanings and power dynamics embedded in the language itself.
That's a great analogy. And this ability to critically analyze discourse is just as valuable in navigating the world beyond the exam hall, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But like social constructivism, post-structuralism has its share of critics, right?
Yeah.
I imagine some people find this whole idea of language shaping reality to be a bit too abstract or even unsettling.
You're right. One of the main criticisms leveled at post-structuralism is that it can lead to a kind of relativism, the idea that there is no objective truth, just different perspectives.
So if everything is just a matter of interpretation, how do we decide what's right or wrong? How do we make moral judgments or take action against injustice?
That's a valid concern, and it's a debate that continues to rage within and beyond the field of international relations. It's something to keep in mind as you delve deeper into these theories. Now for our final post-positivist approach. Shall we explore the world of feminist theories?
Let's do it. This is an area I'm particularly interested in. I'm eager to hear how feminist perspectives challenge the traditional ways of looking at international relations.
Feminist approaches bring a whole new dimension to the table by shining a light on something that's often been overlooked in traditional analyses, gender.
It's about recognizing that for a long time, the study of international relations has been dominated by a very specific and perhaps limited perspective, that of powerful men.
Precisely. Feminist IR theories aim to correct that imbalance by highlighting how gender dynamics shape global politics.
It's like we've been looking at a giant, complex puzzle,
Right.
but only focusing on a few pieces Feminist approaches are saying, hold on, there are all these other pieces that are crucial for understanding the whole picture.
That's a great way to visualize it. And there are different ways feminist scholars have gone about bringing those missing pieces to light.
Okay, so walk us through those different approaches. What are the various ways feminists are tackling international relations?
One way to think about it is to differentiate between empirical feminists and analytical feminists.
So two different paths to the same goal of bringing gender into the conversation. What makes them distinct?
Exactly. Empirical feminists focus on highlighting the lived experiences of women in global politics. They emphasize that women have always been involved in international relations, but their roles and contributions have often been ignored or marginalized.
So they might study things like the impact of war and conflict on women, the role women play in peace-building efforts, or how gender inequality manifests itself in different societies and on the global stage.
Precisely. They bring those often overlooked experiences to the forefront, enriching our understanding of how global events impact different groups of people.
It sounds like they're filling in some pretty significant gaps in our knowledge. What about analytical feminists? What's their approach?
Analytical feminists take a different tack. They're more focused on examining the underlying theoretical framework of international relations and how it's been influenced by gender biases.
So instead of just looking at what's happening on the ground, they're digging deeper into how we think about what's happening.
Exactly. They analyze the very concepts and assumptions that underpin traditional IR theories, pointing out how these often reflect a masculine worldview.
I'm starting to see how this connects to those essay questions that ask us to critique existing theories. This is giving us the tools to do just that.
Precisely. Jan Tickner, a prominent feminist IR scholar, is a great example. She argues that the traditional power politics model, which dominates a lot of IR thinking, is based on very masculine assumptions about competition, conflict, and dominance.
Which makes sense, right? If you're primarily focusing on men in positions of power, presidents, prime ministers, military leaders, then you might come to the conclusion that international relations is all about who has the biggest stick or the most economic clout.
Exactly. And that's the problem, according to feminist scholars. This narrow focus on power over others misses the bigger picture. It ignores the possibilities for cooperation, interdependence, and alternative models of power that don't rely on domination.
So how do feminist scholars propose we rethink power in international relations? What are some of those alternative models they suggest?
Well, for one, they emphasize the importance of understanding power as something that can be shared and collaborative, rather than just something one person or group wields over another.
So instead of viewing power as a zero-sum game, where one side wins and the other loses, it's about recognizing the potential for win-win situations.
Well,
cooperation and mutual benefit.
Precisely. Feminists also highlight the importance of things that traditional IR theories often overlook, like caregiving, community building, and fostering relationships.
These are often considered soft skills or even feminine traits, which is probably why they've been sidelined in traditional analyses.
You're absolutely right. But feminist scholars argue that these are essential for building a stable and just world order. They're not soft skills. They're crucial skills that have been undervalued for far too long.
This is really eye-opening. By bringing in those feminist perspectives, we're getting a much richer and more nuanced understanding of international relations.
It challenges us to question our assumptions, to consider the experiences of those who have been traditionally excluded, and to imagine alternative possibilities for how we might organize ourselves on a global level.
This has been incredibly insightful. It's clear that understanding these feminist critiques is crucial for anyone trying to grasp the complexities of international relations, especially for those UPSC exams.
Absolutely.
Before we move on, let's do a quick recap of the three post-positivist approaches we've covered so far.
Okay, let's recap. We started with social constructivism, which highlights the idea that reality, especially in the social and political realm, is something we actively construct through our interactions and beliefs. It's not just about objective facts. It's about how we interpret and give meaning to those facts.
Right, like that idea that anarchy is what states make of it. It's a powerful concept, especially when you think about how differently states can view the same international system. Then we moved on to post-structuralism, which delves into the intricate relationship between language and power, showing how the way we talk about things, the narratives we create, can actually shape our understanding of events and influence power dynamics.
Exactly. And a key takeaway from post-structuralism is that there are often hidden power structures embedded in the language we use, even in seemingly neutral terms and concepts. It encourages us to be critical thinkers, to question those taken-for-granted assumptions, and to analyze how language is used, to frame events and shape our perceptions.
It's like we're peeling back layers of meaning to reveal the underlying power dynamics at play.
Right.
Which is pretty crucial for anyone trying to make sense of complex global events, whether you're a UPSC aspirant or just a concerned citizen trying to stay informed. Now, shifting gears to feminism, I'm particularly interested in how these approaches challenge the traditional ways. I'm thinking about international relations. I touched on this earlier. But could you expand on how feminist perspectives bring those often overlooked gender dynamics into the spotlight?
Of course. Feminist theories in international relations highlight how traditional analyses have often ignored or minimized the experiences and perspectives of women. They push us to consider how gender shapes power dynamics, both within states and on the global stage.
So it's about recognizing that the traditional narrative of international relations, with its focus on state leaders, military power, and diplomacy, might be missing a big piece of the puzzle by overlooking the roles and experiences of women.
Exactly. Feminist scholars argue that gender is not just a side issue, it's fundamentally intertwined with all aspects of international relations. For instance, they highlight how conflict and war disproportionately impact women and girls, often in ways that are invisible in traditional accounts.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We often hear about the number of casualties in a conflict, but we rarely get the full story of how war disrupts families, communities, and social structures, particularly for women, who often bear the brunt of these disruptions.
Precisely. And feminist perspectives also draw attention to the roles women play in peace building and conflict resolution, roles that are often undervalued or overlooked.
This is definitely prompting me too. Think about those UPSC case studies in a whole new light. Instead of just focusing on the actions of state leaders, I'm now considering the wider social and gender dynamics that are shaping those events.
That's a great point. Feminist approaches can really enrich your analysis and give you a more comprehensive understanding of those complex international situations you'll be examining for the UPSC.
Speaking of the UPSC, you mentioned earlier that there are different types of feminist approaches. Can you unpack that a bit more for our listeners? It might be helpful for them to understand these distinctions, especially if they're going to be tackling those essay questions that require a nuanced understanding of feminist IR theories.
Certainly. One way to distinguish between different feminist approaches is to think about the difference between empirical feminists and analytical feminists.
Okay, break that down for us. What are the key differences between these two approaches?
Empirical feminists are primarily concerned with documenting and analyzing the real-world experiences of women in international relations. They focus on gathering data, conducting research, and highlighting the often invisible ways in which gender shapes global events and power dynamics.
So they might study things like the impact of economic sanctions on women, the role of women in international organizations, or the ways in which gender norms influence foreign policy decisions.
Exactly. They're bringing those lived experiences to the forefront and showing how gender influences everything from global trade to armed conflict to humanitarian interventions.
It sounds like they're providing a crucial corrective to those traditional accounts that often overlook or downplay the experiences of women. What about analytical feminists? What sets them apart?
Analytical feminists take a more theoretical approach. They're interested in examining the underlying assumptions and biases that shape our understanding of international relations.
So they're not just looking at what's happening, but at how we think about what's happening.
Exactly. They analyze the very language and concepts we used to talk about global politics, pointing out how these often reflect a masculine worldview.
So, for instance, they might critique the traditional emphasis on military power and state security, arguing that these concepts are rooted in a masculine understanding of power that prioritizes dominance and control over cooperation and interdependence.
Exactly. They might also point out how the language of diplomacy and statecraft often excludes women and reinforces gender stereotypes.
This is really making me rethink some of those classic IR theories, like I'm seeing them through a new lens. One that's attuned to those underlying gender dynamics.
That's the power of feminist approaches. They don't just add women into the existing narrative, they challenge the narrative itself, pushing us to rethink our assumptions about power, security, and what it means to act on the world stage.
This is incredibly valuable, not just for UPSC aspirants, but for anyone who wants to understand the world in a more nuanced and insightful way. It's about recognizing that gender is not just a separate category, but a fundamental aspect of how power operates in international relations.
Absolutely. And by incorporating these feminist perspectives into our analysis, we can move towards a more inclusive and comprehensive understanding of global politics.
This has been a fascinating discussion. Before we wrap up, could we take a moment to zoom out and talk about the broader significance of post-positivism in the field of international relations? I think it would be helpful for our listeners, especially those prepping for the UPSC, to understand how these approaches fit into the bigger picture of IR theory. So we've spent this episode unpacking these three key post-positivist approaches: social constructivism, post-structuralism, and feminism.
I have to say, it's really shifted my thinking about international relations. It's like I've been looking at the world through a very narrow lens, and now I'm starting to see all these different angles and perspectives I hadn't considered before. That's the beauty of these approaches. They challenge us to move beyond those traditional, often rigid ways of thinking about global politics. They encourage us to question assumptions, to consider multiple perspectives, and to recognize the complex interplay of factors that shape international relations.
And that's incredibly valuable, not just for academics or those of us diving deep into IR theory, but for anyone who wants to understand the world around them, would you say?
Absolutely. Whether you're a UPSC aspirant prepping for those challenging exams, a policymaker grappling with complex global issues, or simply a citizen trying to make sense of the news, understanding these post-positivist approaches can equip you with a more nuanced and critical lens for analyzing events and navigating the world.
For our listeners who are working towards those UPSC exams, can you offer any specific advice on how they can apply these approaches in their studies and in the exam itself?
Certainly. First and foremost, understanding the core tenets of each approach is essential. You need to be able to articulate the key arguments of
social constructivism, post-structuralism, and feminism, and to differentiate between them.
So being able to define those key terms like discourse or social construction.
And to explain those concepts in a clear and concise way.
It's crucial, exactly. But beyond definitions, you need to be able to apply these approaches to real-world situations. The UPSC exams often involve analyzing case studies or current events, being able to use the lens of social constructivism, for instance, to explain how the perceptions of different actors shaped a conflict, or using a feminist perspective to critique a particular policy or international agreement can really elevate your answers.
It's about demonstrating that you can go beyond simply describing what happened and actually analyze those events through these different theoretical frameworks. Right?
Precisely. And don't be afraid to draw connections between the different approaches. They're not mutually exclusive. They can often complement and enrich each other.
So, for instance, you could use a post-structuralist analysis to examine how language was used, to frame a particular conflict.
And then bring in a feminist perspective to explore how gender dynamics influence the course of that conflict. Exactly. By weaving together these different threads, you can create a richer and more nuanced analysis.
That's incredibly helpful advice for those of us navigating the world of IR theory, for those prepping for the UPSC, I imagine. Being able to demonstrate that kind of sophisticated analysis is what really sets those top-scoring answers apart.
You're absolutely right. It shows that you've engaged deeply with the material, that you can think critically, and that you can apply these theoretical frameworks to complex real-world situations. Those are the skills that the UPSC examiners are looking for.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into post-positivism, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question. Pick a current global event that's all capturing your attention. Maybe it's a conflict, a political crisis, or a social movement. Now, try viewing that event through one of these post-positivist lenses. What new insights emerge? Do you see different power dynamics at play? Do hidden narratives or biases become apparent?
It's a challenge, but a worthwhile one. By engaging with these different perspectives, we can move beyond simplistic explanations and develop a more sophisticated and insightful understanding of the complex world we inhabit.
And that, I think, is the ultimate goal of the deep dive. We're not just about delivering information. We're about empowering you, our listeners, with the tools to think critically, to question assumptions, and to engage with the world in a more informed and meaningful way.
Well said. And on that note, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. to delve deeper into these different approaches and to apply them to the events and issues that matter most to you.
Okay. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into fascinating topics. We'll be back next time with Berko, a fresh batch of insights to expand your understanding of the world. Until then, happy analyzing.